And if you go back to 1820, the red part of the diagram here shows you the proportion of people who lived in dire poverty. In other words, not having enough, even for food, shelter, clothing, and certainly not for education and healthcare. And 90% of the world back in 1820 lived in such a state. So I want to talk really about the last 30 years of globalization, but also to put that into some historical perspective. And then at the end of my talk, also talk about some of the challenges to globalization, which have really materialized in the last 20 years or so. But most particularly in the last 10 years and since the financial crisis. Now, I normally begin a talk like this by asking the audience a series of questions to see how they understand economic and social progress since 1990. I think it's impractical to do that in this setting, but I do want to ask just one question, just so that you're not entirely passive and to get you thinking. So if you look at the first slide, it asks you a question. In recent years, the distribution of incomes in the world has stayed around the same, become more unequal, or become more equal. And I'd like to ask you which of those you think is a true statement. So I'm going to maximize my view of the audience to see as many of you as I possibly can. So can you raise your hands if you think that the distribution of incomes in the world has, in the last 20 years, stayed around the same? And you must respond to at least one answer. Can you raise your hands if you think the world has become more unequal? More unequal?
No one.
No one? Okay.
I've already something.
Can you raise your hands if you think the world has become more equal? Okay. Now, this is very unusual because if you ask either a US or a British audience that question, normally about 90% of people think that the world is becoming more unequal. So you have a more realistic view of the world, as we'll see in a few moments, than we do in the UK or most people do in the US. And I'll talk about some of these trends in income inequality a little bit later in the talk. First of all, I want to ask the question, what is globalization? Globalization is normally defined as the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And in fact, that's more or less the first line of the Treaty of Rome, that the Treaty of Rome and the European Union was designed or developed in order to facilitate the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And so, for example, the United Kingdom, which is a particularly open economy, imports and exports about £600 billion worth of goods and services a year. In other words, about 1/3 of national income. So we export higher education. So foreign students come to the UK and pay for a university education. We export financial services and so on. And we import large volumes of manufactured goods, for example, from Asia and from continental Europe, including Austria and Germany. In addition, we have the manifestation of globalization, the free movement of capital, which within the European Union, but also much of the rest of the world, is now more or less complete. And somewhat uniquely in this era of globalization, you have the development of global supply chains. So Toyota, for example, car manufacturer, 40 or 50 years ago, had only factories in Japan. Today, Toyota has 51 overseas factories in 28 different countries. And it sells cars in 170 different countries. And those 51 manufacturing operations actually exclude manufacturing operations making components for Toyota cars, which are not in factories not owned by Toyota itself. If today you were to buy a shirt which said made in China on the label, it really isn't as simple as that. It's likely that the sewing machinery for the shirt was made in South Korea or Japan. The dyes might well have been made in Germany. The cotton might well come from Egypt. The shirt may well be finished and manufactured in China, then could be shipped by a Greek firm with the shipping financed by a UK bank. So even a simple act such as making a shirt can involve businesses from 10 or 15 countries quite easily. Globalization also manifests itself in the free movement of people. In the United States, about 13.5% of the population is foreign born, and over 1/3 of London's population of 9 million is foreign born, and a much bigger percentage are either foreign born or the descendants of foreign born parents. So the free movement of people, which of course has been significantly expanded as a result of the European Union, has been a feature of the last of the growth of globalization in the last 20 years. Now, one of the things about this era of globalization is that it involved a large number of countries that were previously isolated from the world economy. So this includes the former communist countries, countries which made up the Soviet Union, Soviet Union satellite states, so Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Baltic states, and so on. But also a number of countries such as China and Vietnam in Asia, which previously were effectively, up until the mid-1980s, Maoist hermit kingdoms, totally isolated from the rest of the world. So if you go back to 1975, China, Vietnam, a number of other countries were rather like North Korea is today. Now, we might be very concerned about China's human rights record, rightly so, and I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. But China is nothing like as close to the world and has nothing like as bad a human rights record as it had 25 or 30 years ago. Now, it's often assumed that that globalization is a modern phenomenon, and sometimes the phrase neoliberal economics ascribed to economists such as Friedman or Hayek are used as a label to describe globalization. That really is quite historical. There have been several phases of globalization going right back really to the beginning of man. If you look at archaeological finds, you'll find that as soon as man existed, as soon as the earliest records of man existed, we find evidence of people trading. And then, all the way through the Roman Empire, the development of Islam, the Hanseatic League of the early modern era, and so on, globalization took root, and people traded with each other. Indeed, in many senses, globalization is the natural state of people, and it's only when governments put constraints on individuals that they stop trading with each other, and they stop trading with each other across boundaries. And the late 19th century era of globalization, really from about 1870 to the beginning of the First World War, was probably even more comprehensive than the current era of globalization. So it was possible in the late 19th century to move from Britain to almost any country in the world other than Turkey and Russia without a passport. You could import and export. You could import goods from and export goods to almost any country in the world. You could export capital to almost any country in the world. So, in many ways, the late 19th century was actually a more successful and a deeper era of globalization than the current era, but also different in some other respects. And most eras of globalization are brought to an end either by war or by the ravages of disease, destroying as diseases used to. We've been spared this, fortunately, with COVID in modern, developed, more advanced economies, but diseases used to totally ravage economies and totally change the economic parameters within economies, and were capable of bringing about changes, such as, for example, an end to phases of globalization. But globalization tends to be brought to an end by hostilities between countries, which stopped people trading between those countries. The First World War is the most obvious example of that. Just a year before the First World War started, the world was really incredibly open. Globalization was incredibly deep. That was all brought to an end by the First World War. And despite some opening up in the interwar period, it wasn't really until 1980 that the momentum of globalization got going again. So let's return to the modern era. Globalization is actually quite difficult to measure. There are various technical measures of globalization. For example, looking at the price of tradable products in different parts of the world, looking at differences between interest rates in different parts of the world, which can help us understand how freely capital can move. But one measure of globalization is to look at the change in explicit protectionist measures. And the most obvious explicit protectionist measure are the tariffs that we put on the import of goods from other countries. So tariffs are effectively a tax on imports, and the higher tariffs are, the more difficult it is for consumers in your own country to buy goods from another country. So if you go back to the early mid-1990s, you see extraordinarily high tariff rates in some countries. Even Australia, which is a fairly open economy in 1995, had an average tariff rate of maybe 7%. Now, you might not think 7% is all that high, but the average profit margin for most companies is between about 5 and 10%. So if a country is imposing a tariff of 6.8% on the import of your goods into its country, then that's probably going to wipe out the whole of the profit margin. So even quite low tariffs, or tariffs that seem to be quite low, can cause an awful lot of damage in terms of reducing the ability of firms in other countries to export goods and reducing the ability of consumers in your own country to import goods. So in Australia, the average tariff has reduced from 6.8% to just under 1%. In other words, Australia has more or less eliminated tariffs and become a totally open economy, as has New Zealand for that matter. Brazil, back in the late 1980s, had an average tariff rate of 32%, as did China, and both have reduced those average tariff rates very significantly. Again, China is a very open economy. Its average tariff rate is now just 3.8%. Nigeria, in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, really tried to promote homegrown economic development by keeping out imports, particularly in manufactured goods. This was a total disaster as far as Nigeria was concerned. Back in 1960, Nigeria was actually richer than South Korea. Today, South Korea which has been a much more open economy than Nigeria, is much, much richer than Nigeria. So until relatively recently, Nigeria was almost a siege economy with very, very high tariff rates. Today, in international terms, Nigeria still has a very high tariff rate, but only 11%. And India is another country which tried to really cut itself off from the rest of the world in the post-war period and develop under its own steam behind protectionist barriers. Again, this was a total failure, and in the early 1990s, policy began to change, and it removed its tariff barriers and some other constraints as well on the import of goods and services. I should say in India, Nigeria, Brazil, there really is a very long way to go before they are fully integrated into the world economy. So there's been incredible progress in terms of promoting globalization since 1990. And in a few moments, I'll talk about the impact of that in terms of reduction in poverty and reduction in inequality. But it's pretty clear now that globalization is under attack, and it comes under attack from several quarters. So here's a picture of Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, supposedly from opposite sides of the political spectrum in the United States, have rather similar views about globalization. Bottom left there is Francis, and bottom right I've added Paul VI for reasons which I'll come to in a second. And these people have said some pretty negative things about globalization. So this is Donald Trump. Donald Trump said in the last election campaign, you go to New England, Ohio, Pennsylvania, manufacturing is down 30, 40, sometimes 50%. NAFTA is the worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere. Bernie Sanders said something really very similar. I do not believe in unfettered trade. We heard people telling us how many jobs will be created. You are now competing against people in Vietnam who make 56 cents an hour minimum wage. Pope Francis said in an interview with Stamper, I recognize that globalization has helped many people rise out of poverty, but it has also damned many others to starve to death. It is true that global wealth is growing in absolute terms, but inequalities have also grown and new poverty has risen. And Pope Francis said that in 2015. Now, going back a few more years, in 1967, in a letter called Populorum Progressio to the world on development, Pope Paul VI said, trade relations can no longer be based solely on the principle of free, unchecked competition, for it very often creates an economic dictatorship. Now, there are two things which are quite interesting about these statements. The first is that Trump and Sanders are really saying that free trade harms rich countries. Pope Francis and Pope Paul VI are arguing free trade harms poor countries. Now, economists normally assume that they're able to use both models and empirical evidence to demonstrate this quite effectively. Economists normally can show that actually free trade benefits everybody. It benefits poor countries and rich countries alike. It's a positive sum game. Whereas Trump and Sanders are saying it's a zero-sum game, and the poor countries get better off and the rich countries get worse off. Pope Francis and Pope Paul VI are saying it's a zero-sum game, and the rich countries get better off and the poor countries get worse off. I would argue that all of Trump, Sanders, Pope Francis and Pope Paul VI are wrong in those particular assertions that they make. So that's the first thing that's, I think, interesting about those comments. The second thing that's interesting is that today in 2015, so those statements were all made, I think, in 2015 or 2016. So the at the current time, 2015, 2016, but people are saying the same kind of thing today. People are becoming more skeptical about free trade, not just politicians, but also other people, such as people in the church, but other commentators as well, are becoming skeptical about the benefits of free trade. If you go back to the 1960s, the politicians were skeptical about free trade, but also other contributors to the intellectual debate were skeptical about free trade too. So we've almost sort of come full circle from skepticism about free trade in the 1960s to skepticism about free trade today, 2015 to 2020. But in the middle of that, you had almost universal support for free trade. So this is John Paul II writing in 1991. And this is about the time when Reagan, Thatcher, Bush, Clinton and Tony Blair and many leaders within the European Union were really trying to open up the world economy and had a very positive view of free trade. So at this time in the early 1990s, politicians had a positive view of free trade, but also people contributing to political and intellectual debate also had a very favourable view. So this is Pope John Paul II writing in 1991. Even in recent years, it was thought that the poorest countries would develop by isolating themselves from the world market and by depending only on their own resources. Recent experience has shown that countries which did this have suffered stagnation and recession, whilst countries which experienced development were those which succeeded in taking part in the general interrelated economic activities at the international level. And I would say that that is a pretty accurate statement of reality. Those countries which have participated in globalization have prospered, and globalization has benefited both rich and poor countries, but probably has benefited poor countries more than it's benefited rich countries. So let's have a look at some of this data and see what actually has happened to the world economy and poverty, inequality, and so on over the last 25 years. So this chart here, and it's taken from a really excellent website called Our World in Data, which is put together and curated by Max Rosa at the University of Oxford. Strongly recommend that you visit that website. There's a whole range of statistics on interesting issues, which are freely available and free to use for any purpose you like, as long as you credit the website. And this graph here shows you the proportion of the world's population that lived in extreme poverty from 1820 to 2015. And by extreme poverty, we mean people on an average income in today's purchasing power terms of $1.90 a day, which is regarded in a poor country as being just enough to be able to buy food, shelter, clothing, and those other things which are necessary for a dignified life. And if you go back to 1820, the red part of the diagram here shows you the proportion of people who lived in dire poverty. In other words, not having enough, even for food, shelter, clothing, and certainly not for education and healthcare. And 90% of the world back in 1820 lived in such a state. They lived, as I sometimes put it, one bad harvest away from starvation. And if you look at mass migrations around that time, so my own great-great-grandfather came over from Ireland, almost certainly because he and his relatives and his family were starving to death because of the failure of the potato harvest. So you get mass migrations and mass starvations regularly because hardly anybody in the world has more than enough, just enough to live on, even when the harvest comes in. And if you carry on following the graph, even right up to 1990, which is about here, I'm not sure whether you can see the pointer, but right up to 1990, you still find that about 40% of the world's population is living in absolute poverty. And of course, the number of people who are living in poverty is increasing during this time, because the population, world's population is increasing quite rapidly. So we've reduced, in 170 years, we've reduced the proportion of the world's population who live in dire poverty from 90% to 40%. Some progress, but still that's an awful lot of poor people. Now, if you move from 1990 to 2015, the proportion of the world's population who live in dire poverty has fallen from 40% to about 7%. And not only that, the number of people who live in poverty has started falling rapidly as well. So you can more or less say that as much progress has been made in reducing absolute poverty in the world in your lifetimes. I'm assuming that most of you are under the age of 30, in your lifetimes, than in the whole of the rest of economic history put together, which is something, despite all the misery that's around, is something that perhaps we should be celebrating. But what's perhaps even more interesting, I wouldn't say more important, because I don't think anything really is more important than this fall in poverty. What's perhaps more interesting is what's happened to inequality. And over the last 10 to 20 years, as most of you indicated at the beginning when I asked this question, global inequality has fallen really quite significantly. And what has happened is that there's been some rise in inequality within most countries, relatively limited, and it hasn't happened in all countries. But between countries, inequality has fallen really very dramatically. And basically, rich countries have pretty much stagnated in the last 20 years, and previously poorer countries have had rapid catch-up growth. So not just China, as we often assume, China just happens to be the biggest example, but also India, a number of African countries, Pakistan, Vietnam has grown very rapidly. So there's been this big reduction in inequality between countries, so that if we look at the world's population as a whole, inequality has fallen. And it's almost certain that this will carry on for another 20 years because of demographic trends. So on the whole, countries which are poorer are younger, they have a smaller, older population, and their working population is growing, which allows them to be more productive, and it allows a larger working population to support a relatively smaller older population. Whereas, I'm sure you're aware, in the developed world, the population is aging very rapidly. In countries such as Japan, it's now starting to happen in Germany, Italy, and so on, to a lesser degree, actually, the UK or France or the United States. We are seeing a rapid expansion in the number of old people and actually a contraction in the workforce, so that a smaller workforce is supporting a larger population as a whole. And it's very difficult in those circumstances for your national income per head, per capita, to grow. So it's very likely that over the next 20 or 30 years, currently rich countries will more or less stagnate, whilst poor countries, unless there are serious problems such as outbreaks of war, civil unrest, and that type of thing, that poorer countries will continue to catch up. Now, this graph from our World in Data, I think, demonstrates this phenomenon really very effectively indeed. So the top graph shows the distribution of world incomes in 1800. Don't worry about the colors. The colors represent different continents. The middle graph shows you the distribution of world incomes in 1975, and the bottom graph shows you the distribution of world incomes in 2015. And there's a very faint line, which you might be able to see on the graph, which shows you the absolute poverty line. the amount of money people have to have in order that they can buy the basics. And if you look at the income distribution in 1800, the graph actually looks very similar in shape to the typical graph for the income distribution of an individual country, such as Austria or Germany or the UK. But back in 1800, almost everybody was poor. There's an equality of sorts, but it's an equality of misery. Almost everybody is below the poverty line, about 90% of the world's population. Now, if you fast forward to 1975, you can see what's happened. The richer part of the world has pulled away from the world in general, and the income distribution now has two hubs. It's bimodal in the jargon. And in fact, it doesn't look anymore like the income distribution for a country, the graph of an income distribution for a country. It looks actually as if we're living on two separate planets, that you have the rich world over here and the poor world over there. And in fact, at this time, people then coined the phrase, the third world. You had on the one hand, the rich world, then you had the communist world, and then you had the third world, which were all those people who were still desperately poor. So the world has become very unequal in 1975. You have the rich world where everybody is well over the poverty line, or nearly everybody, and the poor world where nearly everybody still is earning below the poverty line. And as you can see, in some cases, for a lot of the population, a long way below the poverty line. Now, if you move on 40 years to 2015, it's amazing what's happened. Essentially, the rich world is where it was before, and the poor world has caught up. It's pushed itself above the poverty line, and we all look as if we're actually living on one planet again. The income distribution for the world, that graph, it looks pretty much like the income distribution for an individual country. So it looks like the income distribution back in 1800, except of course that whereas in 1800 90% of people were below the poverty line, today 90% of people are above the poverty line. And that's an incredible achievement. And again, something that has happened during your lifetime. And this isn't just about incomes. If you look at almost any measure of poverty, so infant mortality, maternal mortality, literacy, life expectation, and so on, you see huge improvements since 1980. Now, I've suggested, we've talked about globalization, I've talked about the reduction in inequality, and I've talked about the reduction in poverty. The question is there a link between the two? Now, I would suggest there is, and most of the economic evidence suggests there is. Most of the economic evidence suggests that okay, so this slide here, it's hardly particularly sophisticated statistics, but this slide here shows the relationship between the freedom to trade of different countries and their income for countries which have a national income per head of less than $15,000 per capita. In other words, poor and middle income countries. So that various organizations produce indices which show how open an economy is to trade. And normally those indices are measured according to a scale from 0 to 100. We don't have to go into how those indices are actually constructed. So every country here is a dot, and the dot shows you the level of income on the vertical axis and the openness to trade on the horizontal axis. And you can see there's a pretty good relationship between openness to trade increasing along the horizontal axis and income increasing along the vertical axis. There are some odd exceptions. One of those exceptions is Cuba, which is technically a country that's very open to trade, but because it's a totally centrally planned economy and because of the US embargo, in practice, it's not really an open trading economy at all. So that, I think, provides some evidence that there is a relationship between openness to trade and national income per head. I think a bit more evidence is shown when you break down the figures illustrating the reduction in poverty that's taken place within the world. So this slide here shows you the number of people in poverty rather than the proportion of the world that's in poverty in different countries over the period 1990 to 2015. And you can see that in East Asia and the Pacific, poverty has been almost entirely eliminated. In South Asia, poverty has fallen dramatically, whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, there's been virtually no change in poverty whatsoever in terms of absolute numbers, although the proportion of people living in poverty has fallen. And again, if you look at the relationship here between the behavior of those continents or parts of continents in relation to globalization and the reduction in poverty, there is quite a strong relationship. East Asia and the Pacific and South Asia have really embraced globalization and become much more open economies, whereas most of the countries of sub-Saharan Africa, although things are beginning to change now, really remain very protectionist. Indeed, they not only remain protectionist in relation to countries outside Africa, very many African countries are actually protectionist in relation to their near neighbors. Now, I don't want to suggest that globalization is the only thing that's going on here when it comes to poverty reduction. There are a lot of other things that are important as well. If you want to reduce poverty in a country, the most important things are probably peace, the rule of law, a well-functioning court system, the protection of property rights, the absence of corruption, and so on. But trade is kind of the handmaiden of these things. If you have an economy which is tightly centrally controlled, there is a tendency for it to be, very often, a tendency for it to be corrupt. If you have strong trade barriers, then those trade barriers, again, very often attract corruption and bribery as people pay bribes in order to overcome those trade barriers. So there are a whole range of things, really, which have improved, a whole range of conditions which have improved in Asian countries, which have promoted economic growth, and globalization and the openness to trade is just one of those factors, but a really quite important factor. Now, I want to, it's stuck, here we are. I want to move on now to talk a little bit about globalization and innovation, because there are lots of benefits from globalization. But perhaps one of the main benefits, the one which is most difficult to quantify, is that globalization promotes innovation. So what is innovation? Well, innovation is normally defined as the application of new ideas or methods. Now, that's a fairly broad and unclear definition. It's not exactly clear what falls inside that definition and outside that definition. But I'm going to try to suggest three aspects of innovation which I think are important. The first of those is innovation in consumption patterns. So globalization radically expands what we can consume and brings to markets both individual products and combinations of products which would not otherwise have been possible, and perhaps most importantly, would not otherwise have been thought of. So innovation is often, is really about doing things new which were not obvious and had not previously been thought of. So one particularly feels this if you're British when it comes to food. Indigenous British food is really not very good. But globalization has opened the British up to an incredible range of foreign foods, which has transformed our eating. Now, this has happened actually since my childhood. I'll come back to that in a moment. But in fact, this trend goes back centuries. So if you go back to pre-Roman times, it was in fact trade and migration which brought animals such as chickens to Britain. But then even then, by the time the Romans arrived, the typical diet in Britain was basically wheat, barley, peas and beans every day of the week, every meal of the day. And then trade in Roman times expanded that diet dramatically to include fruits, nuts, and a wider range of vegetables. And then trade continued to expand that somewhat. Carrots didn't arrive until the 11th century from the East, again as a result of global trade. And then we had trade with the New World, which brought potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, and a whole range of other things which are now grown widely in Europe. And as I've just said, the 20th and 21st century have really kept on delivering a whole new products and ways of eating to the British to add to a cuisine which even in the 1970s was pretty bland and basic. So if you compare the range of food your average British person can eat today compared with when I was a child in the 1970s, it's expanded beyond what we could have imagined. Now, I recently had a German guest visit us at our house, and he was desperate when he came here to have fish and chips. And you would assume, I suppose, as he did, that fish and chips is obviously a British dish, and an indigenous British dish at that. Well, in fact, it's not. It owes its origins to various phases of globalization, in fact. Potatoes obviously came from the New World in Tudor times, and chips came from, I've said France or Holland there, actually it's France or Belgium. Chips came from France or Belgium, probably a couple of hundred years later, and fried battered fish arrived in the UK from Jewish immigrants from Spain and Portugal, probably via Holland. And that was probably in the late 18th centuries. And then the first fish and chip shop was opened in Britain in 1860 in London by another immigrant from the UK from Eastern Europe. So almost every element of the supposedly typical British dish, fish and chips, actually comes from abroad, and actually comes from abroad quite recently. And of course, the innovation, what's different, is to put all these things together, the potatoes then to make chips, and then put the chips with the fish, which has previously been fried and battered to create a single meal, and then open shops in which this meal can be produced instantly and sold. All of these are innovations, but all of these innovations actually required foreigners to bring them about. So you have innovation in consumption. As a result of globalization, we're able to consume things in different ways, which we could not have imagined without both the migration, which comes with globalization, but also the trade that comes from globalization. Then you have innovation in production. So Apple, for example, works with suppliers in 43 countries on the production of the iPhone. And the iPhone itself is an amazing innovation. But in fact, in many ways, it's the construction of that supply chain which ensures that the iPhone can be produced at a cost which is within reach of the ordinary person. So labor-intensive processes can be undertaken where labor is cheaper. Design processes can be undertaken where you have well-trained designers, and so on. We then have innovation in terms of the creation of new ideas and new products. The invention of new things, if you like, which are then translated by businesses into new products. And there are lots of channels for this. One such channel is the transfer of capital for direct spending on innovation by multinational corporations. So in multinational corporations, about 30% of all research and development expenditure takes place outside the home country of that multinational corporation. So multinational corporations operate in lots of different countries, but typically a lot of the research and development takes place outside the home country, because the multinational corporation wants to mix the capital from one country with the raw materials from another, the unskilled labor from another country, and the skilled labor from yet a further country. In addition, migration and the mixing of people in business and education systems are an enormous spur for the network effects that lead to new ideas being created and radical innovation. So in the UK, whilst just 14% of residents in the UK are foreign born, half of the fastest 100 growing businesses in the UK had at least one foreign born founder. And a much higher proportion of migrants start their own businesses than is the case for people who are born in the UK. And the same is true in the US. So Elon Musk is one good example of an immigrant to the US starting an incredibly innovative business in that country. So I want to finish now by talking about threats to globalization. And there's a sense in which globalization the tide perhaps reached a turning point, or at least the high tide of globalization was reached in 2008. And despite all the benefits from globalization, there is no doubt that even before the COVID crisis, globalization was under threat. So there's an index which is produced by the Fraser Institute called the Economic Freedom of the World Index, which has a whole range of indicators for every country in the world of economic freedom and openness. And one of those indicators is for trade openness. And if you look at the last 10 years, then, or rather the 10 years from 2008 to 2018, which is the latest data that they publish, there has been almost no change in trade openness since between 2008 and 2018. It seems that the high tide was reached in 2008. That in fact, within different indicators, that there had been different trends. So there was a significant decrease in barriers to movement of people and capital during that period, and some decrease in tariff barriers to trade. But at the same time, there were significant increases in regulatory barriers to trade. So they're the kind of barriers which countries put up, which are deliberately designed to stop the imports of another country coming into your country, imports from another country coming into your country through demanding that the imports meet particular regulatory requirements, which are just impossible for that just can't be met in the country of origin. So a typical regulatory barrier to trade would be and much discussed in the UK, is the way in which the European Union prohibits the imports from the US of chickens which have been washed with a very weak chlorinated water solution, thus effectively prohibiting all US chicken imports. But things have got worse. Since the election of Trump in particular and the subsequent trade wars, world trade growth began to stall. And in the year to October 2019, there was a 27% increase in the proportion of new import restrictive measures compared with previous years, which were imposed by WTO members. And that's a very big increase. And in fact, in that year, up to October 2019, WTO members introduced 102 new trade restrictive measures, which covered nearly $750 billion of imports. And to put that in context, that's about equal to the total import and export bill of the United Kingdom. So that's an amount of trade roughly equal to the amount that the UK trades, being covered by new import restrictive measures by WTO members. And of course, COVID made things worse. If you, the WTO estimated at the beginning of the current crisis that there would be a fall in world trade in 1 year of between 13 and 32%. Now, the lowest of those estimates, 13%, would mean that there'll be a fall in world trade this year equal to the total fall in world trade which took place after the financial crisis, in 3 years after the financial crisis. The higher of those estimates, 32% fall, would mean that world trade would fall in 1 year by the same amount as it fell in the Great Depression in 3 years, from 1929 to 1932. And that would be totally catastrophic. Now, as it happens, the fall in world trade so far is just over 20%. And the WTO is optimistic that, in fact, in the remainder of the year, from June, because we only have figures to June, that there will be actually an increase in world trade registered. So hopefully we'll end up at the low end rather than the higher end of that WTO estimate of the fall in world trade caused by coronavirus. But maybe what is a bit more worrying is that the sort of arguments which are being made post-COVID, or rather in the current environment related to the COVID crisis in favor of protectionism. Now, COVID may well change to, may well lead to a permanent change in habits. You know, we might have more video conferencing, less traveling for business. People might decide to stay at home more for holidays and go abroad less for holidays. Students might decide to travel less because of the risks involved, or just because different habits develop in the current situation. So it may be that for reasons which are more or less unavoidable, COVID leads to a reduction in globalization in the next 10 or 20 years. But there are also a lot of bad arguments around. People saying, well, if only we protected our markets more, we would actually be better prepared for when we got hit by some terrible disease such as COVID. And really, you know, it's difficult to stress too much how bad an argument that is. One of the reasons why, in fact, most Western European countries have done okay during the COVID crisis and have actually been able to shut down parts of the economy without having totally disastrous consequences is because the diversified sources of our imports, particularly our imports of food, have meant that if one supply chain has been hit as a result of the COVID crisis, we can get alternative supplies of a similar product from somewhere else. And that in fact is a great blessing. And really, I think globalization has reduced the risk of a catastrophic event arising from the current crisis. Now, there's lots of bad news around in relation to globalization. There's a bit of good news, some more positive news as well. Despite Brexit, it appears that the British public are becoming more favourable towards immigration, and I think there's some evidence that we are becoming more favourable towards globalization more generally. So this chart here shows the net negative view of immigration expressed by the British people since 1983. So if you're above that faint line, as we have been above the faint line nearly all the period since 1983, it means that more people oppose immigration than are in favor of immigration. And we've actually dipped in the last year to the most favorable position that index has ever shown in relation to immigration. And the UK government, despite Brexit, I wasn't in favor of Brexit, but the UK government is determined to pursue a free trade and not protectionist agenda. And hopefully, intellectually, it will be able to lead the world in that respect, in trying to change the climate of opinion away from the kind of views that are being expressed by people like President Trump and Bernie Sanders and others in the Democratic Party. But nevertheless, I think there are still some long-term challenges which I think are going to be really quite difficult to face down over the next 20 or 30 years. Firstly, I think China is a real problem. Despite China's huge move forward since the early 1980s, improvement in human rights, however terrible things may still be today, it's better than it was in the 1980s. China is a relatively open economy today, whereas it wasn't just 20 or 30 years ago. I think it is a serious geopolitical threat, partly because there's so much state involvement in the economy. So the economic decisions are naturally tied to political decisions, and that's not a good thing when it comes to when it comes to trying to maintain a ruled-based system of free trade. Also, China's interventions in certain African countries are looking almost, in a sense, have some imperialistic characteristics. And its control of its own people and its human rights record seems to now be deteriorating, unfortunately. And now, if China was a smaller country, it wouldn't worry me quite so much. But China is 1/6 of the world's population, a high proportion now of total global income, and it also has it acts in a fairly belligerent way in many ways towards some of its neighbours. And as we saw in 1913, the outbreak of war can be disastrous for free trade and globalization. So China certainly does worry me. Secondly, the complexity of systems of regulation mean that trade is no longer about what it was about in the 1870s and 1880s, which is basically free exchange between free people. Modern trade agreements are tens of thousands of pages, or paragraphs rather, long. They have to be interpreted by expensive lawyers. Companies lobby for special provisions within those trade agreements, and it's the whole process of developing a trade agreement is much more politicized than it should be. And it also allows companies very often to promote their own interests and protect themselves from competition using the regulatory mechanisms which exist within trade agreements. Thirdly, there's a protectionist forces in the West. We'll see what the US presidential election brings, but in most European countries, you have quite strong political parties with protectionist leanings. So I'm just going to end really with a plea to say that whatever the problems we face, both economically, also culturally and socially, I really believe that protectionism is no solution to those problems. Protectionism promotes hostility between nations and between peoples. It's born of hostility, of course, and suspicion very often, and it then can often create a vicious circle. Protectionism, I think, is very often actually motivated by selfish ends, but is nearly always misguided. So countries almost certainly always shoot themselves in the foot when they pursue protectionist policies. So even if globalization gives rise to some challenges, I think we should have the confidence to address those challenges head on and not accept the rhetoric of protectionism. If we're worried about China, or if we're worried about how we design free trade agreements, we need to have a foreign policy which deals effectively with China. and we need to review how we develop free trade agreements. We should take those issues on in a specific way and at face value. I think there are few and probably no questions in economics to which protectionism is the right answer. And I think there are few and probably no questions in international relations more generally to which protectionism is the right answer. So thanks. That brings an end to my talk. I don't have any picture of you, the audience, now, so I hope everything went smoothly. And happy to take questions, although I suggested we have just a 10-minute break before we do that.